Is they obviously have a health system that is based on private insurance and struggles to run a good public health response. So I think actually in the States, which is ironic, and what is, the world's richest country, could potentially have one of the worst responses to COVID-19. And I mean, even if you have insurance in the US, I was reading, to get a test done still costs around about $150. So it's still quite a significant barrier to someone who thinks that they may have the disease or may have the virus to then go and get tested.
It's 5 to 5, the panel on RNZ National. I wanted to sort of bring this in a lighter note toward the end of our program. An interesting article in the conversation. There have been 5 English grammar examples laid out that make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So here are some tips for the next time a repeat grammar corrector tries to tell you you're saying something the wrong way. You can clap back. To start with, there's no right or wrong of using can or may. Apparently, may I use the toilet and can I use the toilet are both correct. Then well versus good. If you're doing well or if you're good, same thing. Both are right. There are other examples, but it just goes to show how impossible the English language is and grammar is to master. Nikki, you're a writer. How important is grammar to you?
Well, obviously it's important, but language changes and usage changes, and so things, can versus may. I mean, yes, they're both right. One sounds a bit nicer. It's the same as well and good, but language and the usage of it changes over time, and you get used to the new usage.
So what is the right one? Is it you and me or is it you and I?
Well, it depends. They both you can use both, but it depends on the situation, right?
For example?
So if I was going to say if I would you think about without the you. So if I was going to say you're like me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of a better example.
I'm very glad you got asked this question, not me.
It's basically if you think of the sentence without the you in it, and what would you use in that setting? So
yes,
sometimes you wouldn't use I, and sometimes you would use me. So I can't.
Well, if you can enlighten us, text us 21001. What is the best, or are they both interchangeable? Well versus good is interesting, isn't it, Thomas? How many times have you been corrected for saying I'm good, thanks? The question, in answer to the question, how are you? And someone says it should be I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Who does that?
There's a lot of pedantic people around when it comes to grammar. I mean, as a small child, I was delighted to read this because as a kid, my dad always used to correct me about the please may I and please can I, which used to frustrate me. But I mean, I write.
I got that one a lot too. May I?
Yeah, please, yes. Well, I can, but may I? Oh, God. But I think to Nikki's point, I mean, I write a lot. I mean, language evolves, and actually, I mean, English should modernise as a language. I mean, another one which isn't in this list, but things like split infinitives, which is another really interesting debate about whether they are an issue or not. And the general consensus now is they're not. But I used to have a boss years ago who would literally rip any document up that was put in front of him that had split infinitives in it.
Really?
And throw it back at you.
Does language change? Nikki, or is there a standard to which we should all aspire?
Well, yeah, I do think there is a standard. I mean, certain things, certain grammar rules and punctuation should be set in stone.
And what's the bugbear of yours?
Oh, apostrophes.
What about them?
Apostrophe misuse, because it's an abuse, because it's everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And your boss that was ripping up those papers over split infinitives would have a field day with the apostrophes. Because it's everywhere. Signage, advertising, press releases.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would have a field day on this as well. Wonderful to have your company. By the way, I'm not here tomorrow. Tim Watkin is filling in back on Wednesday. Nikki Pazan, Thomas Pryor, thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. It's wonderful to have your company.
Pleasure.
Checkpoint next. I'm Willis Chapman. See you soon.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, Treasury predicts the economic fallout from COVID-19 could be bigger than the global financial crisis. A hard landing for Air New Zealand. It's cutting 85% of long-haul flights. Job losses could run into the thousands. Pharmac warns further disruptions to medicine supplies are inevitable. So who will get the flu and pneumonia vaccines that we have? Polyfest is off and the handbrake goes on other gatherings over 500 people. With some exceptions, we'll have the details. The Prime Minister warns visitors breaking isolation rules could face detention or deportation. And abandoned ship, a luxury yacht, dumps more than 100 passengers in Wellington after abruptly ending the tour. Don't forget, you can watch us live on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Prime Minister has ordered the cancellation of all gatherings of 500 or more people to help slow the spread of COVID-19. The announcement applies to sporting and religious events but excludes schools and universities. Speaking to reporters this afternoon, Jacinda Ardern acknowledged the move will be disappointing to many but says public health must come first.
To slow the spread of COVID-19, reducing the number of people infected, and to protect those who are more vulnerable to severe illness, today Cabinet agreed that gatherings of 500 or more people held outdoors or indoors should be cancelled.
Jacinda Ardern also says she's received early advice from Treasury that the coronavirus could hit the economy harder than the global financial crisis. Airline pilots are worried Air New Zealand may have to shed a third of its workers. The airline has slashed capacity on its long-haul network, suspended flights and raised the need to reduce costs due to the collapse of global travel and the coronavirus pandemic. The Airline Pilots Association met Air New Zealand managers this afternoon, and the association's president, Captain Andrew Ridling, says the airline was upfront about the need to reduce staff. He says a 30% cut would be more than 3,000 staff.
This afternoon they told us that across the business we've basically gone from a $6 billion business to probably arguably a $1 billion business, and that's going to entail up to 30% job cuts across the board.
Andrew Ridling. The Director General of Health says there's been an immediate drop in the number of international arrivals at Auckland Airport. New travel restrictions, meaning everyone arriving in New Zealand has to quarantine themselves for 14 days, came into effect at 1 o'clock this morning. Ashley Bloomfield says they've had an impact already.
Usually on a Monday morning there would be around 2,400 people, and this morning it was 1,000, so there's already been a significant reduction in the number of people arriving.
Ashley Bloomfield says people arriving here are being asked about their self-isolation plans at the airport. If they don't have suitable plans, arrangements will be made to fly them back to where they came from. The New Zealand stock market has had another difficult session as tourism and travel-related stocks took a hammering. The NZX Top 50 index closed down 3.6%, taking the market back to levels not seen in a year. The New Zealand dollar is steady around 60.5 US cents after dropping below 59.8 US on this morning's Reserve Bank's decision to cut the official cash rate to 0.25%. The Royal Commission into Historical Abuse and Care has delayed a public hearing planned for next week. It says the public hearing on the state response to civil redress and civil litigation claims risks spreading the COVID-19 virus. The hearing is now expected to take place in July. Auckland schools who plan to compete in this week's Polyfest say they've been hit hard by its cancellation. The Polyfest Trust called off the event today after they were advised by the Ministry of Health it risked spreading COVID-19. A tutor for Otahuhu College's Tongan group, Fiona Tuli, says she's gutted.
Because there's so much preparation that goes into this, not just in terms of tutoring, but also because kids give up their schoolwork, school time for their schoolwork, and also trainings. Teachers give up time with their families to be here after school. It's very unfortunate.
Fiona Tuli hopes the organisers have a backup plan. A branch of a tropical cyclone will help bring much-needed rain to Northland tomorrow, but not enough to relieve drought conditions there. NIWA is forecasting tropical cyclone Gretel to brush the northeast of the North Island with rainfall and strong winds, but meteorologist Ben Knoll says it will have little impact.
Drought takes a long time to be alleviated, so we need several rain events to do that at this point. And Gretel is only expected to bring, say 5 to 10 millimeters of rain to Northland, so it'll be quite minimal.
Ben Knoll says rain from the cyclone will not reach other drought-affected areas. It's coming up to 5:04. The Wellington Phoenix will play the rest of their A-League season in Australia, based out of Sydney. Football Federation Australia has confirmed that because of the coronavirus, games will be played in empty stadiums. The Federation's head of leagues, Greg O'Rourke, says the Phoenix's 2 games this week will be rescheduled as players go through Australia's quarantine period.
We have had initial conversations that they'll be based in Sydney, and we're now working through venue availability, hotel availability as well. But they're making some fairly concrete plans to leave Wellington tomorrow, to arrive in Sydney later that day, and then stay here for the completion of the A-League.
Greg O'Rourke. The New Zealand Warriors Chief Executive Cameron George says the club is in a unique position heading into the round 2 of the NRL. The Warriors are to be based out of the Gold Coast because of COVID-19 travel restrictions. They will play the Canberra Raiders on Saturday, and George says they're short of players.
We're certainly on the back foot in terms of the number of players available for selection this weekend, and we can't get any more players over there. I've raised that with Todd Greenberg this morning, and we're just giving consideration to some of those challenges, but it's really got us at a disadvantage.
Cameron George. That's the news.
Slashing the cash rate.
The entry into a gunfight, was not much more than a night.
Tourism in strife.
International visitors would be spending across the country around $350 million a week. We are looking at that going down to zero.
Stricter travel policies?
I was expecting Ministry of Health officials to talk to us directly, but no, we handed in our cards and went on our way.
Stay tuned. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. High cloud, scattered rain developing in Northland later today, spreading to Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula tomorrow, then clearing later in the day. For the remainder of the North Island, cloud gradually increasing, isolated showers spreading north this evening, then clearing in the west tomorrow. To Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine weather. Marlborough, Canterbury, North Otago and Dunedin. A few showers spreading north this evening, clearing tomorrow evening. For the remainder of Otago and Southland, cloudy periods with isolated showers becoming fine later tomorrow. Chatham Islands, fine spells, a period of rain tomorrow morning. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight, a hard landing for Air New Zealand. Schools prepare to teach from home and do flu and other vaccines need to be rationed. But we begin with the latest from the Prime Minister. A short time ago, Jacinda Ardern revealed that Treasury's predicting the economic impact of the COVID-19 coronavirus is likely to be more severe than the global financial crisis. It comes as Finance Minister Grant Robertson prepares to unveil his economic stimulus package tomorrow, aimed at helping businesses impacted by the fallout. The government's also taking a hard line with visitors who won't or don't self-isolate. The PM's message: leave before you're detained or deported. The Prime Minister says over the next month, 107 events of 1,000 attendees or more were due to take place across the country, and these will be cancelled.
To slow the spread of COVID-19, reducing the number of people infected, and to protect those who are more vulnerable to severe illness, today Cabinet agreed that gatherings of 500 or more people held outdoors or indoors should be cancelled. This applies to non-essential events such as festivals, fairs, sporting, religious and cultural events. While it currently excludes schools and universities, the Ministry of Education will be working with these institutions to reduce these gatherings as they are able to.
The Prime Minister says there will be zero tolerance for people who don't self-isolate.
Cabinet has given approval for temporary visa holders, those entering into New Zealand, to be liable for detention and deportation if they do not comply with instructions from a medical officer of health relating to a quarantinable or infectious disease. This reinforces how serious we are about protecting the health of New Zealanders and will encourage visitors to comply with our rules or leave voluntarily if they don't wish to do so. Remember that anyone who is deported faces serious and ongoing consequences, including high chances of being refused future visa applications here and in many other countries. I consider this really a message and warning to those who choose to come to New Zealand. We are a country who take our roles and responsibility of being hospitable guests very, very seriously. But in return, we ask that visitors reciprocate. We will look after you if you look after us. If you come here and have no intention of following our requirements to self-isolate, frankly, you are not welcome, and you should leave before you are deported.
The Prime Minister also confirmed she will not be travelling to Vietnam in April for the ASEAN Leaders Conference. And the Ministry of Health is also considering fines for people who refuse to self-isolate as the country ramps up its response to the global COVID-19 pandemic. New travel restrictions came into effect at 1 o'clock this morning, meaning everyone arriving in the country, apart from those coming from the Pacific Islands, has to self-isolate for 14 days. And as well as follow-up phone calls and spot checks, health officials are looking at tougher measures to make sure people follow the rules. For tourists who don't, the message is clear: you are not welcome here. Our reporter Sarah Robson has the story.
South African woman Dunia Toussaint and her son Thomas set off on their big trip to New Zealand before the new travel restrictions came into force. They arrived at Auckland Airport this morning, a few hours after the deadline, and now have to completely change their plans.
You know, when you've planned a trip and you've spent in excess of 6,000 New Zealand dollars and you had already booked and paid your flights, your car hire, all your Airbnb accommodations, we've even booked to go and see Hobbiton. I've tried to make contact with the Airbnbs, they've all cancelled on us.
Arriving from Los Angeles, Jim Simmons says the passengers who landed in the country today were left in no doubt from announcements and arrival forms that they have to self-isolate. He's not looking forward to it, but says he'll do what's required.
So I've been away skiing for a couple of weeks while all this blew up. This is where the fun doesn't start. I presume work knows all about this. I'll phone them today and tell them that I'm self-isolating. So I'll be working from home, yeah. Assuming someone from work delivers my laptop. Otherwise I can't work from home, can I?
The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says the number of people arriving at Auckland Airport has dropped off almost immediately.
Usually on a Monday morning there would be around 2,400 people, and this morning it was 1,000. So there's already been a significant reduction in the number of people arriving.
Dr Bloomfield says everyone is being asked about their self-isolation plans at the airport before they get to immigration.
They need to be able to demonstrate what their arrangements are for self-isolation and have some evidence to demonstrate that that is the case. And if we are not satisfied that is the case, then we will facilitate them making arrangements to fly back to where they came from.
And Dr Bloomfield says they are looking at tougher enforcement measures to make sure people do self-isolate, including fines.
We are actively starting some work on that, and we will do that expeditiously.
Already people are scrambling to cancel their planned trips to New Zealand. Becky Errol lives in London and had booked flights to come home this week for her best friend's birthday and her sister's engagement party. But she's scrapped the trip entirely.
My trip's only 2.5 weeks, so I would just mean coming into the country, sitting in a room on my own, not being able to see my grandparents at all, really, because they're too kind of vulnerable to be put at risk like that.
Hastings woman Taylor Vercoe, who's on holiday in New York, isn't too worried about the new self-isolation requirements. She's returning home as scheduled this weekend.
I'm kind of just taking it day by day more than anything, keeping myself enlightened with the news back home in New Zealand and what's happening here in America, because I don't want to make any rash decisions. You know, if I can stay here and keep going on with my holiday, then I will.
More than 10,000 people or households have registered for self-isolation and more than 7,000 have completed it. At the moment, close to 3,000 people or households are in self-isolation. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
Air New Zealand is likely to reduce its workforce by 30% as the effects of COVID-19 take their toll on the aviation industry. This could mean up to 3,500 employees potentially may lose their jobs. It's being described as the biggest downturn in world aviation since the Second World War. Earlier today, Air New Zealand placed itself in a share trading halt and announced widespread cuts to its international and domestic services. Andrew McRae reports.
Air New Zealand is reducing its long-haul flights by 85% for 3 months from the end of March. On the domestic network, capacity will drop by about 30% in April and May, but no routes will be suspended. The president of the Airline Pilots Association, Andrew Ridling, says these are extremely trying times.
This afternoon they told us that across the business, we've basically gone from a $6 billion business to probably arguably a $1 billion business, and that's going to entail up to 30% job cuts across the board.
The company and the 4 main unions have been meeting this afternoon. The Atu Union aviation organiser, Savage, says while it's not happy with the news, it's not surprised.
I think all of New Zealanders are going to face the effects of the COVID-19 and the possible recession that's going to happen. Aviation workers are at the front line, Air New Zealand workers are experiencing it right now.
He's disappointed the news of a possible 30% cut came before the workers were told.
Our first emphasis will be get out, talk to the union members. We've already got meetings set up business unit by business unit so that workplace leaders can hear firsthand and understand what that might look like in their area and what can be done to try and avoid and minimise job losses.
Globally, other airlines are having to take drastic action. Across the Tasman, Qantas has cut its international capacity by nearly a quarter over the next 6 months. Analysts say they'll have a significant effect on Qantas's business. Last week, British Airways announced it's to ground flights like never before and lay off staff in response to the outbreak. CEO Alex Cruz sent a memo to staff titled The Survival of British Airways and said it was looking at job cuts. He described the industry as facing a crisis of global proportions worse than 9/11. Yesterday, the trade body for British Airlines called on the UK government for help. American Airlines said it plans to cut 75% of its international flights until early May due to the global collapse. It will ground nearly all of its largest planes. Aviation analyst for Forsyth Barr, Andy Bowley, says there will be redundancies at the airline, but Air New Zealand's response will need to be carefully managed.
The company will want to be well positioned for any ultimate recovery, and by making any large-scale redundancies, you limit yourself in terms of how well you can respond to the upside through that recovery phase.
He says Air New Zealand will fare better than others due to the likelihood of funding from the government, its majority shareholder.
But in the context of Air New Zealand's pretty favourable market position in New Zealand, where it's reasonably dominant domestically and has reasonably dominant positions on its international routes, what you tend to find in downturns generally through economic cycles is that the stronger businesses, if they play their cards right, they tend to strengthen.
Auckland Airport's shares opened down nearly 13% following this morning's update to the market, but recovered slightly. But an increase in air cargo to China could prove to be a sign of improvement in the sector, battered by the impact of the COVID-19 virus. Auckland Airport says the massive disruption to international travel and trade is forcing all parts of the industry to cooperate. The airport company's chief executive, Adrian Littlewood, says those higher air cargo volumes should help to partly offset the slide in passenger traffic.
And I actually think that will be an important part of the ultimate recovery. Airlines can hopefully, help to sustain some of those routes through air cargo, providing some support as passenger markets rebuild. This is certainly going to be a very challenging time for the industry, and it's really important that we just work together to try and help each other through.
The unions say government help for Air New Zealand and the wider aviation industry is vital for survival. For Checkpoint, Core Andrew McRae-Tierney.
Meanwhile, in Wellington, more than 100 passengers on board a luxury yacht have been left stranded after their cruise was cancelled despite no cases of COVID-19 or anyone feeling ill. Passengers on board the La Lepreuse were told the news last night and are scrambling to figure out how to get home. This comes a day after Wellington's first COVID-19 case was confirmed. That person travelled from Australia after being tested over there but finding out in New Zealand that the test had come back positive. Logan Church reports.
The milk crate was locked shut today after a visiting Australian man aged in his 50s found out he had COVID-19 while at the popular cafe. Its owners have since shut the doors, and while not commenting publicly today, announced on Facebook it had closed as a precautionary measure despite health officials assuring them the risk of the virus spreading from the man was low. Meanwhile, at the dock this morning, about 100 passengers from Le Laperouse luxury yacht are trying to figure out how to get home. David and Michael from France were on an 11-day cruise from Auckland to Dunedin. But last night they got some bad news, despite nobody on their sailing being unwell.
We were told last night that the cruise would end here in Auckland, and Wellington, and that we could stay on the ship until tomorrow, and the ship's working hard to try and get us arrangements to leave the country.
What was your reaction to that?
Great disappointment. We've been loving New Zealand, yeah.
As of 1 o'clock this morning, all cruise ships not already in New Zealand waters have been denied entry to the country. But Velula Perus was already in New Zealand waters. Checkpoint has asked the boat's owners, Ponon, exactly why the cruise had been cancelled. Early today, it said the company was trying to get all of its passengers home before further travel restrictions blocked them altogether. David says he had also been trying to get through to the airline, but hadn't had any luck.
We have tickets, but we need to change the bookings, and it's hard to reach the airline because their phone lines are always busy.
Have you been trying to get in touch?
I've been trying to get in touch, haven't been able to yet, but we'll figure it out.
Well, have you got a plan B?
I guess we stay in New Zealand. We'll try. Hope we can get a hotel room.
Meanwhile, at Wellington Airport, many passengers leaving the country are expecting to self-isolate for 14 days when they get home. Among them were Jan and Michelle of Sydney, who have been holidaying in New Zealand. The Australian government followed New Zealand's lead yesterday, announcing all incoming travellers would also need to self-quarantine.
We have 14 days self-isolating, so I think that means staying at home, not going out at all, wearing a mask if you go out to put the rubbish bins out. We found out yesterday. So that's what waits us back home in Sydney.
Seeing the situation escalate from afar, the pair were already starting to stock up on things like medicine.
Yeah, I bought 2 weeks extra just in case, and a book just in case, and my iPad just in case I got stuck somewhere.
Meanwhile, Ben and Katie of Boston in the United States have done the opposite. They have come here on their honeymoon, and they're about to go to the usually busy tourist hotspot, Queenstown.
I mean, we're expecting it to be a little less empty than we thought, but we kind of like the seclusion because of it.
But they are worried about the situation back home, which seems to be rapidly deteriorating. The Centre for Disease Control has confirmed more than 1,600 cases across 47 states, including Boston, and 41 deaths.
So what I've been told just from friends and family that it's pretty much deserted, the streets, and the MBTA, our public transportation system, has pretty much been not shut down, but just completely empty, and it's really hard to find basic groceries at the grocery store.
Right. Schools are closed up to a month at this point. Really only essential workers should be on the roads, nurses, doctors, and that's about it.
In New Zealand, there are still 8 confirmed cases, but no new ones in the past 24 hours. In Wellington for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
It is 23 minutes after 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. It seems that COVID-19 is infiltrating all aspects of daily life. Let us know how it's affecting you. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Drug buying agency Pharmac is warning further disruptions to medicine supplies are inevitable in the wake of the coronavirus, with increasing restrictions on air travel and shutdowns around the globe. Almost 65% of medications arrive in New Zealand via passenger planes, and airlines around the country are cutting their flight schedules in the face of travel bans aimed at curbing the spread of COVID-19. Air New Zealand is reducing its long-haul capacity by 85%. Pharmac says suppliers are required to hold a minimum of 2 months of stock in the country, and it estimates there is another 2 months' worth of drugs held by retailers. But it's talking to suppliers to make sure they are able to deliver more. It's rationing paracetamol due to supply disruptions, and Director of Operations Lisa Williams says if they need to, they'll do the same with other drugs.
I think it's inevitable that there is going to be disruptions to supply. Whether or not that's due to manufacturing being reduced overseas or because of supply chains, which may be because of even isolation or quarantine measures occurring in New Zealand or other countries affecting the capacity of the supply chain. So, yes, there will be disruptions, but the buffer that we have in New Zealand of product will help us manage those.
What percentage of drugs you are bringing in do you think are at risk because of those things you've identified?
Well, most of our supplies come from overseas. And even the products that are manufactured in New Zealand are manufactured using raw materials or packaging that comes from overseas. So I would say that all medicines in New Zealand are subject to these risks, which is why we're taking this very seriously and proactively engaging with all of our suppliers.
So say some common drugs like diabetes drugs, heart drugs, cancer drugs, contraceptives. Do we have enough of those?
So those drugs, if they're contracted by Pharmac, which most of them are, we have requirements for minimum stock holdings in New Zealand equal to 2 months' demand. And there's typically another 4 to 6 weeks' worth of stock in New Zealand. So lots of patients will already have a good supply of these treatments at home as well.
In saying that, though, airlines, including Air New Zealand, for example, are cancelling a significant number of routes right through until June. And June's only when they will reassess the situation. So that buffer could conceivably be whittled away very quickly.
Yeah, I think the government's also been really clear that the pharmaceutical supply chain and medicine supply chain is one of utmost importance to New Zealand. So we're working to ensure that sea and air freight routes are open for imports and exports, and that we've got sufficient carriage that is coming to New Zealand to ensure that we can get those products to New Zealand.
Will it be necessary for you to break some contracts with some suppliers?
Well, all of our contracts with suppliers would require them to find alternative products if they can't supply their own products, and we work with them closely to do that. I think it's unlikely that we'll need to break contracts. I think what's happening right now is that our supply chain and suppliers are being incredibly responsive and trying to make sure that New Zealand has access to the medicines it needs.
But presumably those suppliers face the same kinds of problems, just in different locations. Everybody is facing the same kind of supply chain issues because almost everybody is in some form of lockdown.
This is a global issue, Lisa, you're right. And, you know, all countries are facing these concerns. The great thing that we have in New Zealand is that we do have many of our products that are under contracted supply, and we have good stock holdings of most of our medicines in the country.
So Pharmac has a number of sole supplier contracts. Is that presenting any particular challenges to you?
No, anecdotally what we hear from other countries is that the situation of having a sole supply agreement in New Zealand means that a supplier can more easily forecast the volume of demand in New Zealand, so therefore they're holding 2 months' worth of supply of New Zealand's total demand. Other countries' suppliers are trying to forecast how much of their product is going to be purchased.
Can you identify any particular drugs that you're concerned about in terms of supply?
No, as I said before, we're making sure that all medicines are available to all New Zealanders. We're actively engaging with all suppliers and ensuring that they've got sufficient stock and don't have any concerns about their supply chain and have activated their continuity plans.
I understand you're working with your suppliers, but I'm just wondering, are you, reluctant to mention anything because you don't want to spook people?
Oh, no, not at all. We're not in a position right now where we have any particular concerns about particular medicines. If we were in that position, we would be talking to the public about that.
I'm curious, do you have stocks of pneumonia vaccines?
Yes, so vaccines is one product that Pharmac does manage the purchasing and import of, and there are stocks of pneumonia vaccines in New Zealand. Yep.
So how many do you have, and is it sufficient, say, to vaccinate our elderly population? How many do you have?
I'd need to check that exactly for you, but generally for vaccines we're holding at least 4 months' worth of normal demand. Now, obviously, if demand changes for things, that will reduce the length of time that would last for. And at the moment, we've been rechecking our volumes of demand of product for the Pneumovax and other pneumococcal type vaccinations.
Do you anticipate a run on demand for pneumonia vaccines more than usual?
Yep, so we've been watching the discussions in clinical communities about the use of products like this, and we are looking to make sure that we've got sufficient product here to meet New Zealand's demand for it.
So you are expecting an increase in demand for that particular product?
We are, and at the moment it's funded only for specific circumstances. So the stock that we hold in New Zealand is for funded patients, and we're taking advice from the Ministry of Health as to whether or not there should be wider access made available to treatments like this.
So should you need more of this, is there more available for you to purchase?
What we find with our vaccine suppliers is that they're incredibly responsive to trying to find more stock for New Zealand. We have very good relationships with them. But the one thing I would say about vaccines is that they do have a long lead time for manufacture. They take somewhere around 6 months to make. So we would be looking to see what was available already elsewhere in the world. And if demand is growing globally, then the vaccine manufacturers will need to look at increasing their manufacturing.
So you can't guarantee that you'll be able to get extra of these?
We'll do our very best to make sure that we can get what New Zealand needs.
But you can't guarantee that there will be extra stock for you to purchase?
I can't guarantee that there would be extra stock.
What about flu vaccines? Could you get more if you needed them?
Yeah, so the flu vaccine for this year for New Zealand, there's going to be 1.8 million doses of the influenza vaccine available in New Zealand. That's 400,000 doses more than what was available last year. And we're continuing to have discussions with suppliers to see if we can get access to more vaccine for New Zealand.
So we understand that you did make the additional purchase here, but should you need more on top of what you've got, is it available? Can you guarantee that there is extra to purchase?
Well, we're having those conversations with suppliers right now to see what else that they can access for New Zealand.
So unknown at this point?
Unknown at this point, yeah, but we're working hard to make sure that we can get what New Zealand needs.
And that's Lisa Williams of Pharmac. Now, Pharmac has confirmed to Checkpoint that it has just under 90,000 doses of pneumonia vaccines, which it says equates to several months' supply. And coming up on RNZ National, Pacific Dance Festival Polyfest is the latest coronavirus casualty. We speak with the Trust Chair, Greg Pearce. And Auckland School trials lessons from home just in case. New York is in shutdown, restaurants restricted to takeaways and home delivery as US health authorities warn schools there could be closed until the end of May. And in Europe, a warning for those aged over 70 that they may need to self-isolate for months. We'd love to hear feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. Do get in touch. Let us know how coronavirus is affecting you. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's time now, though, for the headlines with Susanna.
The Prime Minister has ordered the cancellation of all gatherings of 500 or more people to help slow the spread of COVID-19. The announcement applies to sporting and religious events, but excludes schools and universities. Jacinda Ardern has acknowledged the move will be disappointing to many, but says public health must come first. She's also told reporters Treasury advice is that the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic could be greater than global financial crisis 12 years ago. Airline pilots are worried Air New Zealand may have to shed a third of its workforce, or 3,000 staff. The airline has slashed capacity on its long-haul network, suspended flights and needs to reduce costs due to the collapse of global travel because of the coronavirus pandemic. The Airline Pilots Association met Air New Zealand managers this afternoon, and the pilots say the airline was upfront about the need to reduce staff based on current modelling. The Director General of Health says there's been an immediate drop in the number of international arrivals at Auckland Airport. New travel restrictions, meaning everyone arriving has to quarantine themselves for 14 days, came into effect overnight, and Ashley Bloomfield says people without suitable plans are being sent back to where they came from. Another large event has been cancelled because of the fears it could spread the COVID-19 virus. Auckland's Polyfest has been called off after organisers say they were advised by the Ministry of Health that the event was too big. Around 110,000 people normally attend the event, where schools compete in dance, music, costume and cultural speech. A branch of a tropical cyclone will help bring much-needed rain to Northland tomorrow, but not enough to relieve drought conditions there. NIWA is forecasting tropical cyclone Gretel to brush the northeast of the North Island with rainfall and strong winds. But meteorologists say it will have little impact, as the drought will need several rain events for conditions to change. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. It is time for business now with Nona Peltier, who joins me in the studio. Nona, so we're getting some results in. Retailer Briscoe's Group. What can you tell us about how they're faring so far?
So retail company Briscoe Group, they have the Rebel Sport as well as the homewares brands. Well, they've done, I guess, what in his own words, Rod Duke told me that it was a spectacular result because they did achieve record sales and profit, even though the underlying, the net profit was down slightly. And that's only because they had to take a tax adjustment like every other company. But if they took that aside, they actually increased their underlying profit by just over 2%. Now, you might think that doesn't sound like a lot, but in the retail sector, that's pretty spectacular, I guess, because it's been a really hard go, and certainly they are expecting harder times ahead. Now, Rod Duke, in his report to the market, said that he would be taking a pay cut. Well, pay cut. He's just not going to draw a salary until at least the end of July, in a way of, I guess, helping out his staff. So this is what he had to say.
For me, I really wanted to do something significant and say to my people, this next short period is all about you, our staff and our customers. It's all about you staying safe, staying healthy, and just looking after yourself. We are very, very well placed. You're very familiar with our balance sheet. You're very experienced in terms of my market share and the sorts of things that we can do. No, I'm not anticipating any layoffs, but I want to stand with my staff, as my senior management have, and just said, look, we're going to take a pay cut. You don't have to, but we're going to.
Yeah, so there you go. That was Rod Duke.
Yeah, that is interesting. Also, obviously, with Air New Zealand's boss basically doing the same thing.
That's right.
And I suppose in some ways a gesture.
It's a gesture. Also, the board of directors of Air New Zealand, too. I mean, is it Air New Zealand that's doing it? I think it is. And Auckland Airport, there's a lot of measures being taken by the chiefs of these large companies, and I expect that there'll probably be more of that, as layoffs seem to be inevitable, unless, of course, you work at Briscoe Group, where apparently layoffs are not on the cards. No. In fact, he was really upbeat. He said that the retail sector is probably going to do it really tough, but he said the first couple weeks of March were busy. There were lots of people in the store. So obviously people are still getting out and spending their money, and he said certainly they're spending it online.
And maybe they're purchasing stuff like, for example, a fry pan and a wok or what have you if they have to eat at home, Nona, because that's the other thing during times of crisis, people staying home.
Yes, I'm sure, the funny thing about this is that right now we do seem to be in a crisis where every day it's quite a shock. And the market is, today, the numbers that I had to do into the closing market report were shocking to me. And, but there were some upsides through the day, too. I don't know how many stories we processed, but for example, we had a cut in fuel prices today because, again, another sort of a shock type of announcement. So Brent crude oil has dropped by about 50% this year in response to there's a price war going on between the major producers, but also because of the energy demand going down. So there's a lot of oil out there. It's basically a glut. And that's caused Z Energy to drop their fuel prices twice last week. First 6%, then 7%, and now again 5 cents across all its grades.
So I suppose that's some good news for consumers at the pump. Overall, though, what were we looking at on the market today?
So I better correct that. Did I say 7% and 6%? Because it should be cents.
Cents. Okay.
Yeah, cents. It should be cents. Sorry. Let's just get that right. Okay. And what were you saying?
Market overall. While that is sort of an up story for consumers at the pump, what were the overall machinations on the market today?
Well, look, this morning was pretty rough, which you would have expected after the Reserve Bank governor cut the official cash rate to 0.25%. That caused a shock in the currency market, so our dollar dropped below to 59.8 US cents. That's quite low. It's recovered. I mean, so at this afternoon, for example, it was at 60.6 US cents, and it was really toppy against the Australian currency, which is doing it tough at 98.1 Australian and 49 British pence. So just going back to the equities market, that shock came before the market opened at 10 o'clock. And when the market opened, Air New Zealand had already put itself into a trading halt at that stage and announcing to the market, we've heard already in the news, quite a lot of information about how it's affecting them. Like a 85% reduction on their international routes.
Yeah, long haul, 30% on domestic.
Yes,
a 30% drop in domestic capacity.
And more news to come on the Trans-Tasman route. So what happened? We don't know what happened to the airline's share price because, of course, it isn't a trading halt. But Auckland Airport also came and last week we talked about them downgrading their guidance by $50 million. Well, today they said, forget it. We're not going to
try and guess at a number.
We're cancelling that. So their shares ended down 20.9%.
That is a big chunk.
Yeah, that's huge.
So I noticed on your piece of paper there that you've got Sky TV. I'm interested in this because obviously they're sports heavy and sports events are being cancelled like Topsy.
That's right. So I will tell you that, but before we jump to that, I just want to say that Tourism Holdings, the camper van company, their share price dropped to 31.8%.
Because they have
exposure to the North American and European markets. So Sky TV, it dropped 21.8%. And that's in the interim while it reviews the impact of all the cancellations.
Yeah, because what is there to watch? Where's their product going? Yeah,
exactly.
That's interesting.
And it's just at a time when people will be wanting to watch.
If they're stuck at home for 14 days.
Exactly. That's another shocker. And of course, overall, the local market, like I say, it opened down 4.5% roughly in late trading, morning trading. And it improved when the Australian market opened because the Australian market just dropped down like 7%. Last I looked, it was at 7.6% down. We finished down only 3.6%. I say only 3.6% because that's a huge number.
What were
350 points down. But if this helps, we moved to 9,477 points on the index, which is where we were this time last year.
Okay.
So it's not the end of the world. It's certainly it's a big step down. But, even when we had the global financial crisis, markets did recover. There you go. They're going to recover again at some point. We don't know when. How long this lasts is anyone's guess.
Thanks, Nona. That's Nona Pelsier with all our numbers there, and there's a lot of them because it is a moving feast, as she says. Now, today's cancellation of Polyfest over COVID-19 fears could be the death knell for the event. The second year in a row, it's had to be canned. About 110,000 people normally attend the 4-day school competition in dance, music, costume and cultural speech. Organisers were told by the Ministry of Health that Polyfest was too big to trace any contacts of a confirmed case. After being called off last year in the wake of the March 15 mosque attacks, the organisers say they were already under huge financial strain due to lost ticket sales. Polyfest Trust Chair Greg Pearce told our reporter Nita Blake-Person this could be the final straw.
To be honest, it puts a huge financial concern on the viability of Polyfest moving forward. To be fair, we have run on a very fine line over the last decade or so regarding Polyfest as it's got bigger and bigger. And these unprecedented events have actually tipped us over that line. So we'll be, over the next few weeks, approaching various agencies, including government ministries. But we'd also obviously really like the same organisations and industries to approach the Polyfest Trust Board as well to ensure the future viability of Polyfest because there's a significant financial loss that will occur from these 2 consecutive Polyfests.
How much money are we talking, and are you saying this could be the end?
Well, I mean, potentially we run at on average annually we run a small surplus, which is normally less than $100,000. And at this stage, we could be looking at operating costs of $600,000 to $700,000 for this year's Polyfest. And of course, we need to clarify with our sponsors and trust organisations whether we can use that for this year's payments of outstanding to the creditors, or are we guaranteed these amounts for next year and so forth. So it's a really complex picture at the moment, which we're working our way through.
But there's a possibility Polyfest won't be able to run next year purely due to financial constraints.
To reiterate, if we don't get significant support guaranteed for the next 2 years regarding Polyfest, that is a real possibility, unfortunately, which would be a tragedy for our students and our communities within Auckland.
What feedback have you been getting from schools and kids today, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, our students are really resilient, and not a lot phases them, but this has hit hard. For example, Aotearoa College has got a fair evening tomorrow night, and I'm not sure how that's going to look now, but I do know the students will need to perform because the school needs to acknowledge the hundreds of hours that goes into preparing for Polyfest, and acknowledging those efforts and rewarding those students for their passion. And it's really difficult for the families and the tutors and the staff who see the students push themselves day in and day out for the 6 to 8 week period leading into Polyfest. It is so important to them.
And are the kids understanding of the wider reasons for cancelling, or are they just seeing their hard work go down the drain?
No, as I said, our students are forgiving, they're resilient, and they are, unfortunately, in various ways, used to taking knocks in life, and but they get back on the bike very quickly. So, I mean, obviously this announcement has just filtered through, but today, and I'm still seeing it out my window now as I speak to you, students departing from groups who have just finished practice as normal. We've got 8 cultural groups, for example, at Aotearoa College, and it's been business as usual, and they'll be preparing for the evening tomorrow. So at least that is some way we can acknowledge the importance of what they have contributed towards Polyfest.
And that is Polyfest Trust Chair Greg Pearce there speaking to our reporter Anita Blake-Person. That event has, of course, been cancelled, a 4-day event that usually attracts over 110,000 people. If you're one of them who was practising, getting ready for that, let us know your thoughts on the cancellation. You can text us 2101 or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Some local sports clubs may not survive the COVID-19 pandemic as the outbreak continues to decimate the sporting calendar. Events and matches across the globe are either being cancelled or going ahead in empty stadiums to avoid mass gatherings. The Super Rugby tournament's been suspended. Black Caps one-dayers have been cancelled. The Black Sticks won't be travelling to Pro League games in Europe, and 2 Kiwi teams are in Australia for the foreseeable future. Overseas, the UK is considering banning sports fixtures. Ferrari has shut down its Formula One and road car factories, and the NBA basketball is suspended until further notice, to name just a few. Amy Williams reports.
When sporting events get cancelled, everyone takes notice. Sports management expert and senior lecturer at AUT, Richard Wright, says the cancellation of high-profile sporting events marks an unprecedented line in the sand.
The minute sport has been cancelled, people start to take it seriously because it's such an important part of society. When you can't watch your sport anymore, you know something serious is going on.
Dr. Wright says the business of sport is being thrown into disarray, from sponsors who rely on fans in the stands to clubs that rely on memberships. He says smaller clubs from national to regional levels couldn't plan for such an unprecedented situation.
It is likely that the key thing is we just don't know how long it's going to last. If it keeps going for months, then yes, I could see it very likely that some sports organisations won't be able to survive this.
Travel restrictions mean 2 of New Zealand's top sports teams will now be based in Australia for the foreseeable future, allowing them to finish the season over there. The Warriors will be based on the Gold Coast and this weekend will play their second round match against Canberra at Robina Stadium. The match was supposed to be at Eden Park. The team's chief executive, Cameron George, says there are lots of unknowns about the rest of the season.
We don't know where we're playing after this weekend, or if we're playing after this weekend. So, again, it's so difficult, these circumstances, and not only the Warriors are dealing with. Obviously, ours is a little bit probably more escalated, our challenges, than others.
It's a similar story for the Wellington Phoenix, who'll play the rest of their A-League season across the Tasman, based out of Sydney, to empty stadiums. Football Federation Head of Leagues Greg O'Rourke made the announcement today.
They're making some fairly concrete plans to leave Wellington tomorrow, to arrive in Sydney later that day, and then stay here for the completion of the A-League.
The Phoenix players will go through a self-isolation period, and the 2 games they were due to play this week will be rescheduled. As for players and athletes, sports management expert Richard Wright says he's concerned for those who have cancelled competitions, but their mindset should be no different to being on the sidelines due to an injury. Dr. Wright says athletes don't play for the crowd alone.
They play for their sport. They play because that's what they do. The crowd go to watch them, and this borderline now when they talk about the Olympics potentially going ahead with no crowd, and realising that these are athletes, this is what they do, this is their business, this is their day job. The fact that people pay money to watch them is a side issue.
The national BMX team are trying to get their heads around how they'll be affected by the latest developments on the coronavirus. Due to the cancelled qualifying events, cycling's governing body plans to retroactively use March 3rd as the cut-off point for Olympic qualification in mountain bike, BMX racing and BMX freestyle. Olympic BMX hopeful and silver medalist Sarah Walker says this will affect 3 New Zealand riders who are trying to make the Olympics.
It's a lot of unknown, and a lot outside of our control. So what's in our control is just going to training and working hard and then getting our heads around where everything's at.
She's among athletes keeping a close eye on any updates for the upcoming Olympics in Tokyo. Officials have said that a decision would have to be made by late May around whether COVID-19 is under control to the point the Games can go ahead. There have been no announcements at this stage that they'll be postponed or cancelled. For Checkpoint, Amy Williams.
And it is 8 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keep your feedback coming. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The number of cases of the coronavirus continues to rise in the United States, and America's top infectious disease expert has warned the US health system could be overwhelmed. With more and more businesses and public facilities shutting their doors, there are warnings US schools could be closed until the end of May. President Trump has told his citizens to relax and says the government is doing a great job of containing the virus.
We see what's happening. We see what's going on in other countries. We're looking we're learning from watching other countries, frankly. There's a very contagious virus. It's incredible, but it's something that we have tremendous control of. I think very important to young people of good health, and groups of people just are not strongly affected. Elderly people that are not well or not well in certain respects are really a dangerous group. We have to watch them. We have to protect them very much. We have to really watch over them and protect them because they are very vulnerable.
President Trump there, and there have also been chaotic scenes at airports in the US where travellers were forced to wait hours in huge queues to be tested for the coronavirus. They are being funnelled through 13 designated airports despite fears that the crowds could help spread the disease. The BBC's Jane O'Brien reports.
As the last link to Europe closed, panicked Americans rushed to beat the travel ban.
Immigration at Chicago's O'Hare Airport was overwhelmed, with passengers reporting enormous crowds and unsanitary conditions.
Here at Washington's Dulles Airport, though, it seems the shutdown is already taking hold because it really is eerily quiet here. This is normally one of the nation's busiest international hubs, but looking at the arrivals board, there is already only a handful of planes coming in from Europe.
Americans returning on a plane from London were grateful to be home.
Just given the timing, I think we honestly just lucked out, just given that we got back today instead of tomorrow, because that would have been a lot more hectic.
The airline industry is reeling from the travel bans and cancellations as fewer Americans risk travelling even within the country. American Airlines, the world's second largest carrier, is cutting capacity and suspending almost all long-haul international flights from Monday. The Trump administration is promising sweeping measures to help prop up the economy as America grinds to a halt.
What I'd focus on is, one, what do we need to do right now? Because it's clear we need to get economic relief to the economy.
A shortage of testing kits continues to hamper efforts to get an accurate picture of how far the coronavirus has spread. In Denver, Colorado, people queued for hours at one of the drive-through sites that are starting to open up. But at least one person has been cleared. President Trump, who faced public pressure after coming into contact with an infected person, has now tested negative. But across the country, cases are rising, and so is the death toll.
Jane O'Brien with that report. Europe is the epicentre of the coronavirus, and Italy has seen a big spike in infections. France is closing restaurants, cafes, cinemas, clubs and ski resorts, while people in Spain are restricted from leaving their homes. New cases of coronavirus have been registered in Romania, France, the Czech Republic and in Spain, while Italy remains in crisis and under lockdown. In response, a number of countries are moving to close not just their schools and public events, but also their borders. The ABC's Linton Besser reports.
In Madrid, police drones have taken to the air, warning pedestrians to return to their homes. Patrol cars issue the same warning as they circle the city's main square. And in Barcelona, police have used crime tape to seal off the city's main beach. Following Italy's nationwide lockdown last week, Spain has now instituted the same drastic measure, utterly transforming the country. Here's 22-year-old Melissa Fiorentino, a teacher from the Gold Coast who's now living in Seville.
It's quite strange here. I think because we've gone from Seville itself is quite a lovely, lively place, to going and seeing the streets completely empty. You'll see a few people here and there that are walking their dogs and just going for walks to get out of the house. It's still quite uncomfortable.
It's not just Italy and Spain. Austria has banned gatherings of more than 5 people and has closed schools and most shops. France, too, has shut its schools, as well as cafes, restaurants and cinemas, although local elections are still going ahead. And the Czech Republic and Slovakia have both closed their borders. Not since the Second World War has Europe witnessed such measures. In the United Kingdom, where there have been criticisms of the government for the pace at which it has responded to the crisis, the Health Minister has now flagged a new measure which has caught many by surprise.
The government will be asking the over 70s to self-isolate, potentially for a period of months, at some point in the future.
That is in the action plan, yes.
In a bizarre round of Sunday morning television interviews, Matt Hancock confirmed the elderly will be, in his words, shielded from the community.
We absolutely appreciate that that is a very big ask of the elderly and the vulnerable, and it's for their own self-protection.
As Europe bunkers down, now wholly isolated from the United States and increasingly segmented by its own national governments, ordinary people are doing what they can to cope with the growing sense of solitude. In Italy's eerily quiet cities, apartment dwellers are joining each other in song.
The ABC's Linton Besser with that report. And in breaking news, the Unite union, which represents over 900 workers at Sky City, has told Checkpoint it is engaging with the company on how they're going to manage the main gaming floor of the casino in light of the government's announcement on a ban of gatherings indoors of more than 500 people. Considering the floor of the casino, the union says, can exceed that on busy nights. Checkpoint has sought comment from Sky City and will come back to you with any developments. And we'll have more on that ban on gatherings after 6. A lot of you getting in touch and raising questions about whether it applies to workplaces as well.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata tēnei. The Prime Minister says restrictions to slow the spread of COVID-19 could apply to gatherings of fewer than 500 people. A directive has been given that all gatherings of 500 people or more, whether indoors or outdoors, should be cancelled. This includes festivals, fairs, sporting and religious events, but excludes schools and universities. Jacinda Ardern says the government will release further guidance on other gatherings such as weddings and funerals later in the week.
There are certain circumstances, whether you're in close proximity and it's a large number of people. That's why it's really important we get that extra guidance out there. Again, I'm not going to run through multiple scenarios. What's best is if I compile all of that information and make it publicly available to every New Zealander.
Jacinda Ardern. Ms Ardern has also revealed she's received early advice from Treasury that the coronavirus could hit New Zealand's economy harder than the global financial crisis. The Stark assessment comes ahead of the release of the government's business support package, which is to be announced tomorrow afternoon. Ms Ardern says there is no existing rulebook for the economic response.
The preliminary advice I have received from the Treasury this weekend is that the economic impact of the virus on New Zealand could be greater than the impact of the global financial crisis.
Jacinda Ardern says the multi-billion-dollar economic response will focus relentlessly on jobs. The Queenstown Lakes District is bracing for job losses as travel restrictions bite. The district's Mayor Jim Bolt is calling for cool heads, community spirit and for people to avoid panic buying. But he says it's inevitable that many will lose their jobs, particularly as visitor numbers dry up across the country. Mr Bolt says the District Council is working on how to help its ratepayers, but he says strong government support is needed.
Life will not go on here as usual. This is a very serious situation. I'm enormously concerned for the survival of business, wage earners. Many will lose their jobs. That's a fact of life. We're concerned about support for those people, both financially and mentally.
Mayor Jim Bolt. The drug buying agency Pharmac is warning further disruptions to medicine supplies are inevitable in the wake of coronavirus, with increasing restrictions on air travel and shutdowns around the globe. Most medications arrive in New Zealand via passenger planes. Pharmac is already rationing paracetamol due to supply disruptions, and Director of Operations Lisa Williams has told Checkpoint if it needs to, it'll do the same with other drugs. She says almost all medications have an overseas connection.
Even the products that are manufactured in New Zealand are manufactured using raw materials or packaging that comes from overseas. So I would say all medicines in New Zealand are subject to these risks, which is why we're taking this seriously and proactively engaging with all of our suppliers.
Lisa Williams from Pharmac. Banks have moved to lower variable interest rates but won't confirm if more drops are to come. The Reserve Bank this morning cut its official cash rate to a record low 0.25% from 1%. The major banks are passing on the full cut to customers. Kiwi Bank's Chris Gregg says further cuts are still to be discussed.
It was a bit of a surprise announcement, so we've been really focused on getting that variable rate change through and letting all our customers know what's going on. So whilst today there's been no change on the fixed rates, we'll review that in the future in line with how the market's trending. Of course, we do need to balance that with the needs of our depositors as well.
Kiwi Bank's Chris Gregg. Residents of an Auckland suburb where 2 people were found dead this morning are shocked by the events. Police are making inquiries into the unexplained deaths at a property in Kelston's Manatu Lane, but say it's too early to tell what happened. One local resident, Hayden Lockley, says it came out of the blue for the neighbourhood.
It's normally a pretty quiet area. All out here, I've lived here for 20 years. It's
normally pretty quiet. I don't know why all these strange things are starting to happen in the area.
Hayden Lockley. It's 6:04. The New Zealand Warriors will re-evaluate their next step in the NRL following Saturday's game against the Canberra Raiders. The Warriors are currently based on the Gold Coast as the NRL competition proceeds as scheduled. Captain Roger Tuivasa-Sheck says the plan to keep the Warriors in Australia to avoid self-isolation due to the coronavirus initially came as a shock, but the team are thankful for the support they're getting.
You start thinking about worst scenarios. You're stuck in Australia, can't go back to your families. But I think once we get a bit of clarity on what's happening, and the government and the NRL and everyone in the rugby league community have been real supportive and helpful. So we're just taking it day by day, and we know it's going to work itself out.
Roger Tuivasa-Sheck. Football Federation Australia says the Wellington Phoenix players are on board with a move to Sydney for the remainder of the A-League season. The Phoenix players leave for Australia tomorrow and will stay there for the 6 rounds remaining in the competition. The Federation's Greg O'Rourke says the team's 2 games this week will be rescheduled as players go through quarantine.
The majority of the players would prefer to come here and complete the A-League season and continue to do what they do, and that is to be professional football players.
Greg O'Rourke. That's the news.
Tonight on Night, Stephen Harrison on catalysts and how a poet from the late Roman Republic influenced a couple of Kiwi poets a couple of millennia later. We have a window on the world of aeroplane fume events, more than just a stink in the cockpit, and Dana Johansson looks back on the weekend sport, just as likely to be played in front of empty stadiums, if they played it at all. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Central High Country. High cloud. Scattered rain developing in Northland later today, spreading to Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula tomorrow, then clearing later in the day. For the remainder of the North Island, cloud gradually increasing. Isolated showers spreading north tonight, then clearing in the west tomorrow. To Nelson, Buller and Westland, fine weather. For Marlborough, Canterbury, North Otago and Dunedin, a few showers spreading north tonight, clearing tomorrow morning or clearing tomorrow evening. For the remainder of Otago and Southland, cloudy periods with isolated showers becoming fine later tomorrow. Chatham Islands, fine spells, a period of rain tomorrow morning. RNZ National. It's coming up to 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The Prime Minister has told event organisers around the country to cancel all gatherings of more than 500 people to help slow the spread of coronavirus. Jacinda Ardern made the announcement this afternoon at her weekly media conference after lengthy meetings with her fellow cabinet ministers. Now, the announcement, which follows similar moves around the globe, comes before a major economic stimulus package due to be unveiled tomorrow. Our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch, joins us now. So, Craig, what does this directive actually apply to?
Good evening, Lisa. Yes, all major events, indoors and outdoors, this applies to festivals, fairs, sporting events. The Prime Minister talked about religious and cultural events as well. So there are more than 100 events over this next coming month, with more than 1,000 attendees planned. They will all have to shut down. The obvious ones coming up, there's the Cuba Duper Festival here in Wellington, there's the Armageddon Expo, likely also to include the Book of Mormon musical, which is going on up in Auckland at the moment. There is a distinction, the Prime Minister said, between different events. For example, movie theatres and the like may be able to implement mitigation plans. So although the Civic Theatre, for example, in Auckland has 2,000 seats, if you had a system where you could operate at a smaller capacity, you could come up with some mitigations that could be put in place in movie theatres and cinemas around the country. For now, it seems like universities and schools are exempt from this. The Ministry of Education is going to be giving them specific advice. And if that seems odd, if it seems somewhat bizarre that schools and universities aren't included, the Prime Minister says that's because other countries that we are modelling ourselves on, ones that are following best practice like Taiwan, have not shut down their schools. And she says that she's listening to the best advice, the best evidence, and that what she's being told at the moment is that that's not where New Zealand is at this point. Now, a lot of people at home will probably have questions about some of those smaller events, things like weddings or large parties. which may be coming up, which they may be planning on going to. The Prime Minister says there will be more direction. She'll give more advice, more prescriptive guidance on that later in the week. Again, it's possible that organisers will be able to put some practices in place to ensure some level of acceptable social distancing so that they could still go ahead, but we're going to have to wait on that level of detail.
Yeah, so those are perhaps smaller events, weddings, etc., funerals. But we're getting a few questions here, Craig, and you might be able to answer this, or it may still be too early in the piece. There are a number of really big employers. We're getting some feedback on that, say ministries, factories, even where you work at the Beehive. So do we know what is happening in those circumstances? We know that the union is talking to Sky City, the casino, about the gaming floor, which has hundreds of people in it on any given night. What about workplaces?
Yes, the advice that we received from the Prime Minister today related directly to events or to gatherings of that type. However, she did acknowledge that there are businesses out there with large staff. She says that at the moment, many of them are putting their own practices in place off their own back. They're allowing practices such as people working from home and the like. Whether or not we're going to see more specific direction or a guidance from the government is not clear. Maybe that will come later in the week, along with that guidance about smaller events. Here at Parliament, the Speaker has indicated that there are plans being put in place in case it does need to be suddenly scaled back. If we need to have fewer MPs sitting in the House, for example. At the moment, they've just cancelled public tours here. They're going to be cancelling school tours of Parliament as well. But the public meetings are still going ahead, same with the select committee meetings, and the public are still allowed in. So it seems like some of those questions are still being worked through.
Also, the Prime Minister took a pretty hard line around self-isolation today. What did she have to say?
She did. I suspect some of that was in response to the reports today of some tourists arriving into the country saying they won't comply. How is this going to be enforced anyway? Now, the Prime Minister responded. She said that she will be taking a zero-tolerance approach to this, the government issuing a clear warning. If you refuse to self-isolate, you will be deported. Now, down the line, it may be that people are required to sign statutory declarations at the airport, for example, which could carry large fines if they are broken. However, at the moment, the Prime Minister seems to think that the threat of deportation is enough. Obviously, it's a different story for New Zealanders, people who are here. You cannot deport a New Zealander. There are provisions in place. A New Zealander could be technically held in an institution and a police officer put on the door if it came to that. But the Prime Minister seems to think that the vast majority of New Zealanders are going to want to follow the rules and will do so.
Obviously, Craig, we've got this business support package that's going to be announced in full tomorrow. What should we expect there?
Well, we can expect it to be a significant announcement, a massive amount of money. The Prime Minister said today, in quite a stark assessment, she said that Treasury had told her that the economic impact of coronavirus could exceed that of the global financial crisis. The logical conclusion of that, a recession is coming, and that's the first admission of that likelihood by the government. The Prime Minister has said that tomorrow's package will be the most significant she'll announce. For perspective, she announced late last year a $12 billion infrastructure package. And she did indicate this morning that by significant she means in terms of consequences, in terms of import and impact, but perhaps more so than in dollar figures. But we're certainly talking in the magnitude of billions rather than millions. All indications are this is not going to be something like what we've seen in Australia. Australia taking a very broad brush approach, one of cash payments and the like. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have both repeatedly described this as a much more targeted measure, a more targeted package. And what they mean is targeted on one focus, keeping people in jobs, cushioning that hit on businesses to keep as many businesses in business as possible, keeping as many people in jobs as possible. The thinking being that these more broad brush approaches are less effective in a situation like this. There's no point spending big bucks on tourism campaigns if no one is travelling. There's no point dishing out cash if people aren't going to spend it anyway because they're in quarantine. So expect a big focus on wage subsidies, direct support to businesses to deal with the immediate impact, and I'd also expect a big focus on health. The Prime Minister has repeatedly said that the health response is the most important element here, that if you can avoid a mass outbreak, a mass contagion, that New Zealand will better weather that economic storm. So much more to come on this yet, a long way for this to play out.
Thanks, Craig. That is our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch, there with the details of the ban on gatherings over 500 people. This is public gathering events. Organisers have been told to put a lid on those. And obviously tomorrow we are anticipating this business support package. Meanwhile, the company that terminated an 11-day cruise for 150 passengers in Wellington today says the decision was necessary as international borders begin shutting. Checkpoint spoke to some of those passengers aboard the Le La Perouse, who were trying to figure out how to get home after they were told the cruise was ending, despite no one being sick on board. Many of those passengers are from areas that are hard hit by COVID-19, including the United States and Europe. But Ponon Yacht Cruises Asia Pacific Vice President Monique Ponfort says the company was worried that its passengers would not be able to get home at the end of the cruise.
We have made the decision to disembark our guests, as there is at the moment no confidence that the borders from which our guests come from will remain open. Airlines have begun to cancel flights all over the world, as we know, and so in consultation with our tour operators, and as a huge disappointment for us and for our guests, we have had to make the necessary decision as the situation continues to worsen globally hour by hour. Look, no guest or crew member across our fleet of ships are suspected nor have been diagnosed with coronavirus. So the ship has now indeed disembarked all guests in Wellington and will proceed to Auckland to upload our containers, to refuel, and then to exit New Zealand and proceed to Noumea without any passengers on board.
Monique Ponfort says the company is working through new travel plans with its passengers. Auckland Grammar will trial teaching students from home later this week amid international coronavirus closures. On Wednesday, all students in Year 10 will stay at home and study via the school's online portal, followed by Year 11 on Thursday and Year 9 on Friday. The principal, Tim O'Connor, told our reporter Katie Doyle the school wants to test its e-learning capacity in case it has to close at a later date.
This is just part of our COVID-19 preparations, and two purposes really. One, obviously, is to maintain, well, they're both linked to our primary responsibilities to provide a healthy and safe environment for our boys, and then the second, to provide uninterrupted access to subject-specific content so that young men in our care can continue learning.
Do you anticipate that you may need to use this in the future, that schools may be shut down?
Yes, well, I think most secondary schools in the country would have some form of e-learning platform that they're using with their communities, and one of the purposes of having a platform of that nature is so that you can provide ready access to educational resources and class content at any point in time. So, yes, there's no doubt at all that the time will come, whether it's with COVID-19 or whether it's another situation in the future.
And is your school doing any other planning when it comes to COVID-19 with sports events or school camps?
Look, there's a lot of planning that hopefully we don't need to utilise, and we're communicating with our parents, with staff and the boys about it. So any form of event at the moment that is pending has been cancelled, including our cross-country on Friday, and we're waiting for information from external groups about competitions that may be in summer tournament week, including Māori Cup, National Volleyball Tournament and the like, because there are significant logistics that have gone into getting our teams around the country, like any other school. And so we're going to obviously have to work through cancellations and, of course, communicating with parents and with boys about that should they be cancelled.
Is that a concern in the sense of student well-being? You know, for example, Polyfest is something that students get quite amped for, they get excited for. If we're just going to see kind of cancellation after cancellation?
Look, boys are gutted already. They know what's coming. They just prefer for it to be announced. I think everyone knew what was coming with Polyfest. We had North Island Secondary School's rowing champs on the weekend, and I think the feeling amongst all schools who were competing at North Islands was that this would be the last event of its type, the last opportunity, if you like, for them to compete this season. And look, they are gutted. They've put their heart and soul and their commitment into their sports and activities, and want to see it right through so that they could be tested and measured against the best in the country.
And that's Auckland Grammar Principal Tim O'Connor speaking with our reporter Katie Doyle. As economies around the world recoil in the face of COVID-19, their carbon emissions are also shrinking. With businesses shutting up shop and global supply chains disrupted, pollution from transport and manufacturing have taken big hits. Just how much New Zealand's emissions will drop remains to be seen, but environmental scientists and the climate change minister all agree that it's what happens when the economies kick back into gear that will matter the most. Nita Blake-Person reports.
Airports are emptying out and factories are grinding to a halt. Entire communities are in quarantine and countries are shutting their borders. The effects of COVID-19 are being felt across the planet and in its environment.
In the short term, I think that carbon emissions are going to fall. You know, people are not moving around so much. Trade has dropped. International travel has dropped. Production has fallen. So I'm sure that there will be a temporary drop. The big question is, will the world go back to the way it was once the epidemic is past?
Alistair Woodward is a lead author for reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's one of a number of scientists keeping a close eye on how the disease outbreak is affecting emissions. Another is Victoria University Director of Environmental Studies, Professor Rafe Chapman.
The obvious thing that's happening is that emissions are falling, so it's most obvious in China, where, for example, there's been a big drop in airline travel, and so carbon emissions from that source are falling.
It's not just flights from China. With much of the country now in lockdown, figures from the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air show emissions have dropped by 25%. Climate Change Minister James Shaw says New Zealand will no doubt be affected too.
There is already a reduction in tourism, for example, and so obviously that leads to a temporary drop in emissions as well. You know, I need to say any effect is only going to be temporary, and so we need to sort of stay focused on permanent solutions.
While he says there aren't any forecasts around New Zealand's situation, the current shutdown is not the way we want to be curbing rising carbon emissions.
It's not a good thing to have a situation like we've got with COVID-19 and all of the impacts that go along with that. That is not the way that you want to reduce your emissions. What you want to do is reduce your emissions by decoupling economic development from growing emissions.
Professor Chapman says the very swift response to COVID-19 has been in stark contrast to how governments have responded to climate change.
Now, I don't want to be alarmist, but there's the potential for climate change to generate hundreds of millions of deaths. And that is, it's a different order of magnitude, much bigger scale than the impact of COVID. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the pandemic here is trivial. It's not, but a pandemic at the moment. But, climate change will start to have an enormous impact as we go forward. And, the estimates already are that, many tens of thousands of people are dying already from climate change. That's actually more than from COVID.
But Greenpeace's Amanda Larson says it shows that where there's a will, there's a way.
Climate change deniers love to perpetuate this myth that it's too hard or inconvenient to change the status quo. But what we're seeing is that both people and governments can adapt quickly in the time of crisis.
James Shaw says climate change and COVID-19 are both crises, but are very different in their nature and require different responses. As the government prepares economic packages to ease the impact of COVID-19 on New Zealanders, Mr Shaw says they'll be bearing carbon emissions in mind so that the current drop isn't just a temporary measure. For Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
It is 24 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Jurors in the trial of a Samoan chief accused of slavery have retired to consider their verdict. Joseph Unga Matamata denies 11 charges of human trafficking and 13 charges of dealing in slaves between 1994 and April last year. Anusha Bradley is at the High Court in Napier and filed this report.
After a 6-week trial, the jury of 5 men and 6 women retired at 2:30 this afternoon. In her summing up, Justice Cull told jurors they must consider whether the accused treated each of their 13 complainants as his property.
So the link between ownership and slavery is, in a word, control. In any situation of ownership, the owner controls the thing owned. Now, where a slave is concerned, this control is tantamount to possession. It is control exercised in such a manner as to significantly deprive that person of their individual liberty.
The Crown has argued throughout the trial that Joseph Matamata used threats, violence and strict rules to control the complainants. In summing up last week, Crown Prosecutor Clayton Walker told the jury the way the accused treated a 15-year-old girl who escaped from his home in 1995 is proof he considered her to be his property.
He has gone up to Auckland to retrieve her, and the manner in which he has brought her back speaks volumes about how he was treating her while she was living with him. And that demonstrates the control that he is exerting over her, the type of control of her as his chattel, as his property. She had a job to do for him, but she has run away, he has brought her back.
But in his closing address this morning, Mr Matamata's lawyer, Roger Phillip, told the jury the evidence against his client does not stack up.
But if he was a slave master, as suggested by the prosecutor, why would it that these men would be allowed to go and play rugby, attend sport, go and share meals with other guests who came to their house, walk the streets, buy alcohol, take a vehicle to work, without Mr Matamata, or visit friends, go night clubbing or drinking in the local hotels or rugby club rooms?
Each slavery charge carries a maximum penalty of 14 years in prison, while the human trafficking charges carry a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison or a $500,000 fine. In Napier for Checkpoint, Anusha Bradley.
Dunedin energy company Aurora Energy will be paying a penalty for its dilapidated infrastructure after negotiating a figure with the Commerce Commission. Today, the High Court in Wellington heard Aurora Energy failed to properly invest in its poles, cables and transformers between 2016 and 2019. The Commerce Commission says that resulted in an increased number of power cuts. Jonathan Mitchell was in court.
The Commission's lawyer, Laura O'Gorman, says Aurora got a warning in 2012 for breaching quality standards and still failed to improve its ailing infrastructure.
Significant weaknesses in asset management processes. There were issues with the availability and unreliability of data used for asset management decision making, and there was a lack of alignment between financial and asset management.
She says that amounts to serious negligence. Ahead of today's hearing, both parties agreed to a set figure for a penalty, and with a 38% discount, the total Aurora will face is just under $5 million. Tim Smith, who represented Aurora in court, says the company accepts it failed to act quickly after being warned in 2012, however did attempt to make changes later on. He says the board and management was refreshed and an external consultant reviewed the network.
The engagement of that consultancy was deliberately set up so that it was a tripartite agreement between the consultancy, Aurora and the Commission, with agreement that the consultancy's primary duty would be to the Commission. So a very open process.
Mr Smith says it also introduced an infrastructure investment program and reviewed its asset management plan.
Aurora has refrained from paying a dividend and has drawn on shareholder funding, that is essentially council funding, to finance investment in its network. It's undertaken a comprehensive review of its asset management plan to address the failures that the Commission has identified.
Justice Mallon reserved her decision but indicated the court is likely to agree a final penalty in the order of $5 million. In Wellington for Checkpoint, call Jonathan Mitchell, tēnei.
And some time for quick feedback before we go. Julian's been in touch saying, I work as a tour guide and driver in the New Zealand tourism industry. I found out today that I have been laid off indefinitely. I'm sorry to hear that, Julian. Julian goes on to say the industry is effectively being destroyed by the government. I'd like the government to be honest about why this viral pandemic is being treated with such extreme, desperate and unprecedented measures, and what is their long-term plan. Sue says, I'm self-employed. I work with products in the tourist market, which is increasingly more difficult. Future prospects are now pretty dire. We are back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Prime Minister has issued more restrictions to slow the spread of COVID-19, which include outlawing gatherings of more than 500 people, such as Wellington's popular Cuba Duper Festival. And Ms Ardern says there's no rule book for how to respond economically to pandemic-induced difficulties, but the government's starting by focusing on jobs. Air New Zealand could reduce its staff by a third, or 3,500 workers, as it takes a massive hit from flight reductions. And the Mayor of Queenstown says a tourist drop-off means locals should brace for major life changes with job losses and local businesses threatened. Those are the headlines. Our next news at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
We urge everyone to take precautions, and I think our Prime Minister and our health officials have been really good at hammering those basic hygiene practices.
Live with local, national and international stories, and some music with your news.
When I listened to that album, I